They say the soil on that stretch of Louisiana earth still bleeds when it rains. Locals call it the widow's ground. Beneath the tangled oaks and ruined columns where a plantation once stood proud and white, the dirt turns the color of old rust. No one plows there anymore. No one builds. Because those who have tried, farmers, developers, even historians, claim to hear the same thing when dusk falls. A man's breath, steady and heavy behind them, and a woman whispering their name. The story begins in 1824, with a man history tried to erase. His name was Moses Gant, though the ledgers recorded him only as property. A field slave. No birth date, no family. But even among the broken and bound, Moses carried something others feared: silence. He never sang in the fields, never prayed aloud, yet overseers avoided his eyes. One wrote in his journal, "That Negro looks through me as if he remembers a time before God." The plantation belonged to Thomas Bellwether, a man both cruel and careful. He built his fortune on sugarcane, on debt, and on the bones of those who cut his fields. His wife, Eleanor Bellwether, was said to be sickly, delicate, and devout. But letters found decades later suggest something else: loneliness, obsession, and a fascination with the man she was forbidden even to name. In August of that year, Bellwether was found dead in his study, his skull shattered by the very branding iron he'd used on others. Moses was gone. So was Eleanor. 3 weeks later, a marriage record appeared in New Orleans. The bride, Eleanor Bellwether. The groom, a free man of color named Moses Grant. The church that signed the document burned down that same year. No one ever found the bodies. Only the soil remains and what it remembers. It began with a journal. In 1937, over a century after the Bellwether murder, a Works Progress Administration surveyor named Henry Mallon was cataloging old parish properties in rural Louisiana when he stumbled upon a locked chest buried beneath the floorboards of a collapsed church. The structure had long since been abandoned after the fire of 1824, its name lost to time, its congregation scattered. Inside the chest was a set of pewter rosaries, a child's shoe, and a book wrapped in oilcloth. The initials E.B. pressed faintly into the cover. At first, Mallon thought it was a prayer book, but as he brushed away the soot, he saw the title written in fading ink: "Testimony Concerning the Deliverance of My Soul, E. Bellwether." He read the first page that night by lantern light. What he found unsettled him so deeply that he never returned to the site again. According to his own report, the writing alternated between scripture and what he described as confession, almost delirium. Eleanor wrote of visions in the cane fields of a man she believed touched by the curse, of Cain yet anointed by heaven. She described how the land spoke to him, how he could hear the dead in the roots of the sugar cane. She wrote, "He does not pray to God as we do. He prays to something older. When I asked him who he called upon, he only said, 'The one who freed me before chains were forged.'" The journal abruptly ended after a passage dated August 11, 1824, the night of the murder. The final line read, "He says we are free now, but freedom sounds like thunder in the blood." Mallon handed the book over to state archivists in Baton Rouge. A week later, his house burned to the ground. He survived, but never spoke of the journal again. The Bellwether file vanished from the WPA records the following month. By the time the Bellwether property was revisited in the late 1940s, the plantation itself had become little more than an overgrown ruin, swallowed by the marshlands. Locals avoided it. Hunters claimed their dogs refused to cross the property line, whining and trembling at the edge of the old iron gate, where the Bellwether crest still clung in rust. The state's Department of Historical Preservation sent a small team in 1949 to survey the remains before the land was sold. Among them was Dr. Leonard Cray, a folklorist from Tulane University whose work focused on slave songs and postbellum mythologies. He had read fragments of the Mallon report. just enough to suspect that the plantation wasn't merely a footnote in economic history, but a scar in cultural memory. Cray's notes describe the site as unnervingly preserved, despite more than a century of decay. The air smelled faintly of iron, though no metal was visible. In what had been the main house, the brick hearth remained intact. Inside the ashes, Cray's assistant found something impossible: the imprint of a hand, pressed deep into the stone itself, as if the rock had once been soft beneath living flesh. They also uncovered the remnants of a baptismal font near the ruins of the estate chapel. Inside it were bone fragments, human by all appearance, polished smooth by water. Cray later wrote that one piece appeared to have been carved with a single phrase, written in crude letters: "The freed man waits." That night, as they camped near the site, the team reported hearing footsteps circling their tents, slow, deliberate, and heavy. One of the men swore he saw a figure near the tree line, tall and still, holding a lantern. But when they searched the following morning, they found no footprints, no light, and no trace of passage. 2 weeks later, Dr. Cray withdrew his funding application. His report was sealed by Tulane's Department of Anthropology and never published. No one expected to see Eleanor Bellwether again after her husband's death. Newspapers from 1824 described her as vanished, possibly abducted, or taken by her husband's killer. But in late 1826, 2 years after the murder, a woman calling herself Eleanor Grant appeared in New Orleans. Dressed in mourning black and accompanied by a tall, quiet man of mixed descent who spoke little and gave no surname. They rented a house on Ursuline Street near the old convent. Neighbors recalled strange habits. The couple held no gatherings, received no visitors, and attended Mass only once, on All Souls' Day. The priest who confessed Eleanor noted that she seemed consumed by visions of redemption, yet convinced she could not die. He described the man beside her as gentle, obedient, and wronged by the world. Within months, the priest himself was found drowned in the Mississippi. Records show Eleanor purchased land under her new name, property once belonging to a plantation family that had gone bankrupt. Within a year, the estate was thriving again under the management of her husband, Moses Grant. Local accounts speak of his unmatched strength, his unyielding silence, and his uncanny influence over the enslaved workers. A merchant's diary from 1828 reads, "No lash is used on that land, and yet they toil as if driven by something unseen." Rumors spread that the crops grew faster, the cane sweeter, but the soil darker. Some said Eleanor walked the fields at night with a candle, whispering prayers that were not in any Bible. Others swore they heard music, low, rhythmic chanting that rose from the ground itself. When Eleanor finally died in 1833, she was buried on the property. No record of her funeral exists, but one undertaker's ledger lists a strange notation beside her name. "Husband refused coffin. Said the earth would take her whole." What followed after her death was never written in newspapers or parish books, only in whispers. By 1835, the name Moses Grant had become both a marvel and a warning throughout southern Louisiana. A former slave who now owned land, managed workers, and paid his debts in gold. Such things were whispered about, not spoken aloud in parlors. But what truly unsettled the parish was not his wealth, nor his silence. It was what began happening inside the church. The pastor of St. Augustine's Chapel, Reverend Abel Worthing, was a man known for his rigid sermons and his fear of the supernatural. On the first Sunday of Lent that year, Worthing stood before his congregation trembling, eyes bloodshot, voice breaking between prayer and panic. Witnesses later claimed he shouted that the devil had taken human form and bought salvation with blood. He named no one, but everyone understood who he meant. He spoke of a covenant sealed in the earth, of a woman who could not rot, and a man who heard the soil breathe. Parishioners fled the church before the sermon ended. That night, Worthing's bell tower caught fire. The next morning, the Reverend was found in the graveyard behind his chapel, his hands folded, his mouth filled with black soil. The official cause was listed as suicide. Yet when his body was prepared, the undertaker recorded an impossible detail. His fingernails were packed with roots, fresh and green, after Worthing's death. Attendance at St. Augustine's dropped to nothing. The congregation disbanded within months, and the church itself was sold for lumber. Still, the rumors endured. Field hands claimed that Moses Grant's voice could be heard at night, echoing from the ruins, reciting scripture backward, in a language no one recognized. A traveler's journal from 1836 described it best. The town fears him not because he sinned, but because he was forgiven by something we do not understand. By the spring of 1838, whispers of children began to surround the Grant estate. No census records list births, yet townspeople spoke of 3, all born within a single year, all with eyes too pale for their color. None attended school, none were baptized, and no midwife in the parish ever claimed credit for their delivery. When asked how the children came to be, Moses reportedly said only, "The Lord restores what the world destroys." Their names were Samuel, Ruth, and Gabriel, though only Ruth appeared in parish ledgers, noted briefly as mute from birth. Visitors who came to the estate to trade sugar or horses said they saw the children working the fields beside grown men, moving with impossible rhythm and endurance, never speaking, never sweating. One traveler from Natchez wrote, "They seemed to hear something beneath the ground, as if answering a call from below." In 1842, Ruth was found wandering the road near St. Landry's Church, barefoot and humming a melody no one recognized. When the priest offered her water, she stared at him and whispered, "She's still breathing." Then she fled into the woods and was never seen again. That same year, a storm tore through the parish. Lightning struck the main house of the Grant estate, igniting the upper floors. Locals rushed to help, but Moses refused entry, standing on the veranda as flames consumed the roof. When the fire died, the structure stood eerily intact, the wood charred but unbroken. From that night onward, the plantation became known as the house that wouldn't burn. By 1845, only one person was still seen tending the fields. A tall man, always dressed in black. Some swore it was Moses himself, unchanged, untouched by time. Others claimed it was Gabriel, grown into his father's face. The land continued to produce the soil rich as blood, but no one dared to buy from it anymore. In 1851, nearly 2 decades after the fire, state records show that the Grant plantation was listed for sale. The document, preserved in the St. Landry Parish Archive, carries Moses's signature, the same steady, deliberate script found on his emancipation papers from years earlier. But the sale never went through. 3 separate buyers came forward. The first, a merchant from Baton Rouge, vanished en route to the property. His carriage was found days later, the horses still tethered, their eyes open and clouded as if from fright. The second, a lawyer from New Orleans, withdrew after visiting the estate once. In a letter to his wife, he wrote, "The house speaks when the wind blows. It calls me by name." The third buyer, Colonel Alistair Pryor, was not so easily deterred. He arrived in December of that year with a team of men to conduct a full inspection. According to one of his laborers, they found the fields unnaturally fertile despite the cold. The cane stood tall and green, uncut, and humming softly in the wind, a sound like distant voices beneath the leaves. Inside the main house, they found little furniture, but the walls were covered in scripture. Every verse had been written backward, as if reflected in a mirror. In the master's study, a ledger sat open, its ink still wet. The last entry read simply, "Payment received. Freedom eternal." That night, Pryor's men heard movement upstairs, heavy footsteps pacing from room to room. When they opened the door to the master bedroom, they found the bed perfectly made, and an impression in the sheets as though someone had just risen. Pryor fled before dawn. His testimony was never submitted, but his journal survived. The final line reads, "The land remembers who owns it. and it does not forgive the living. The plantation was never listed again. By the late 1850s, the Grant Plantation had become a place people spoke of only in fragments, half prayer, half warning. Travelers along the parish roads swore they heard singing near the property lines, though no workers remained. The sound wasn't like hymns sung in church, nor the call-and-response rhythms of the fields. It was deeper, drawn out, mournful, and layered, as if 100 unseen voices were rising from beneath the soil. A former overseer named William Dodd, one of the few who dared to speak publicly, testified in 1859 that he returned one night to steal tools left behind. He claimed the air grew heavy as he neared the cane rows. The ground was moving, he wrote. Not the leaves, the earth itself, breathing slow, and underneath it, a song like words I almost knew. That same year, a traveling priest from Lafayette conducted a brief exorcism at the property after a child from a nearby family went missing. During the ritual, witnesses said the priest stopped mid-prayer, eyes fixed on the ground, and whispered, "It's not the dead that haunt this place. It's the living who won't stop calling." He left without finishing the rite. Months later, local farmers discovered that their own fields bordering the old Grant estate had begun to yield crops out of season. Cane grew through frost, roots twisted in strange spirals. Water from nearby wells turned reddish-brown, metallic to the taste. A folk song began to circulate among the enslaved communities along the bayou. It went, "The man who broke his chain still walks. He sows his soul in the cane stalks, and when the bell tolls black at noon, the ground will sing his name too soon." The song was outlawed by parish decree in 1860. Yet field hands kept humming it under their breath, believing that if they stopped, the ground might start singing for them instead. When the Civil War reached Louisiana, many plantations burned, fell, or vanished beneath ruin and occupation. Yet the Grant estate stood untouched. Union scouts sent to seize the property in 1863 reported that the land appeared deserted, yet strangely tended. Fresh-cut cane filled the storehouses, though no workers could be seen. Fires burned in the hearths, and the main house looked newly whitewashed, pristine against a world collapsing. Lieutenant Harold Keyes, who led the company, wrote in his campaign diary, "There was a man standing on the porch when we arrived. Tall, black, eyes like polished stone. He did not move as we approached. When I asked his name, he said only, 'You already know it.'" Keyes ordered his men to search the house, but they found no one inside. When they returned to question the man again, he was gone. Only a single handprint remained on the porch railing, dark, wet, and steaming in the cold. That night, soldiers camping nearby reported hearing chains dragging across the veranda and footsteps pacing the upper floors. One man swore he saw candlelight flicker in the windows, moving from room to room. At dawn, Keyes discovered that 3 of his men were missing. Their rifles were found stacked neatly by the front steps as if offered back. The Union command branded the report unreliable and struck the site from official maps. The company was reassigned within a week, but local families remembered. After the war, when Union and Confederate records were cross-checked, something unusual emerged. Moses Grant's name reappeared in tax filings listed as freeholder, St. Landry Parish. His handwriting was unchanged. His age, unrecorded. His race, unknown. It was as if the war had passed him by entirely, like smoke curling around something solid, something it could not burn. Those who tried to visit the land afterward said the same thing. The gate never opened. The air never moved, and the soil, though dry, always looked freshly turned. By 1871, the parish surrounding the old Grant land had become something else entirely, a place where funerals went unspoken and graves went unmarked. The church that once rang its bells for the living now tolled only for the missing. The locals called it the parish of the unblessed dead. No one could say when it began. First, the cemeteries filled with shallow burials, coffins too light when lowered, soil that refused to settle, Families reported hearing knocking beneath the ground days after funerals. In some cases, graves had split open overnight, the bodies within reduced not to rot or bone but to fine black dust. Doctors from New Orleans attributed it to flooding, to gas, to superstition. But when the parish priest, Father Benoit, attempted to rebury one such body, he found the coffin perfectly dry. He later wrote in his journal, "There is something in the earth here that hungers differently. It does not consume, it replaces." The disturbances grew worse each year. Livestock went missing. Children spoke of a tall man at the fields, wearing no hat, carrying no lantern, whispering that Mama's waiting in the roots. The priest organized nightly prayers to banish what he called the hunger in the land. But the more they prayed, the louder the voices became. Parishioners began to hear humming under the floorboards during Mass, slow, rhythmic, identical to the forbidden hymn once sung in the cane fields. In October of 1873, Father Benoit vanished after leading his congregation to bless the perimeter of the Grant property. His rosary was found hanging from the gate, every bead turned black as coal. When a new pastor was assigned months later, he refused to move into the rectory. His letter to the diocese ended with a single sentence: "The soil here knows more scripture than I do." By then, half the parish had fled. The other half stopped burying their dead. In 1884, an industrial engineer named Silas Corbin arrived from New Orleans with a simple goal: to drain the Grant marshlands and turn them into usable farmland. The parish, hollowed by poverty and rumor, welcomed him as a man of science, someone unafraid of ghosts and superstitions. Corbin scoffed at the tales of singing soil and wandering widows. He said the land's secrets could be measured, mapped and conquered with enough ditches and dynamite. He began work in May, hiring a team of 20 convicts from the state prison, men chained together, each step echoing like iron in a tomb. They cleared brush, cut trenches, and drove stakes deep into the wet ground. Yet something was wrong from the start. The deeper they dug, the thicker the soil became, dense, sticky, and hot to the touch even at night. Water seeped upward instead of down. Tools rusted overnight. On the 12th day, one laborer collapsed, screaming. Corbin's report notes, "He claimed the mud spoke his name. I dismissed it as heat delirium." 2 others vanished before week's end. Their chains were later found near the canal, snapped clean through as though by immense pressure. That night, Corbin recorded the sound of low vibrations coming from beneath the earth. He described it as a hymn without words, like something exhaling through the soil. His final entry, found weeks later in a soaked journal, reads, "It isn't water we're releasing. It's memory." When a search party arrived, the site was abandoned. Every tent and tool remained, but the trenches had refilled themselves overnight. Not with mud, but with a dark, viscous liquid that smelled of iron and decay. The ground pulsed beneath their boots like a living thing. The state sealed the project and declared the area geologically unstable. Corbin's remains were never recovered. But for years afterward, locals said that when the summer heat swelled the marsh, you could hear his voice counting, softly, endlessly, as though still taking measurements underground. By 1902, the Grant property had become the focus of a different kind of curiosity, not from farmers or priests, but from academics and occultists. Among them was Dr. Miriam Voss, a linguist and ethnographer from Boston who specialized in African American spiritual songs and field chants. She had read fragments of the banned folk hymn, "The Man Who Broke His Chain," and believed it encoded what she called a theology of resistance. Voss arrived that winter with a phonograph, wax cylinders, and 2 assistants. Her goal was to record the surviving spirituals of the parish before they vanished. The locals met her politely, but their refusal was unanimous. They told her the songs weren't forgotten. They were buried for a reason. One elderly woman warned, "You don't catch the sound. The sound catches you." Undeterred, Voss camped on the edge of the old Grant estate and began recording the night air. Her first cylinders captured only static, wind, and insects. But on the fourth night something new emerged. Distant humming, layered voices rising and falling in unison. She described it as a harmonic pattern too deliberate to be natural. Her field notes grew increasingly erratic. One page read, "They're answering the machine. They think it's calling them home." The recordings, later archived at Tulane University, contained 6 minutes of continuous tone, low, resonant, shifting like breath. Toward the end, a single voice separates from the rest. It speaks 4 words in perfect English. "The soil remembers me." When her assistants awoke the next morning, Voss was gone. The tent was undisturbed, the wax cylinders packed neatly in their case. Footprints led from her camp into the fields and ended at the old canal. Her body was never found. But every phonograph cylinder recovered from that expedition still carries faint background noise, even now like someone breathing softly against the microphone, waiting to speak again. In 1917, a junior archivist at Tulane University named Charles Endicott was assigned to organize a backlog of field recordings collected by the Folklore Preservation Project. Among them, the 6 wax cylinders from Dr. Miriam Voss's ill-fated expedition. Endicott was meticulous, methodical, and skeptical of superstition. His early memos mock the idea that sound could haunt the listener. But after 3 days in the archive basement, his tone changed. He wrote to his supervisor, "The Voss recordings are not mere sound. They possess rhythm, but not human rhythm, a kind of pulse beneath the pulse. I have begun to hear it after the machine stops." The following week, janitorial staff reported finding Endicott asleep at his desk, the phonograph still turning though the needle had worn through the wax. He told them he'd been listening for the silence between. By the 4th night, security logs show that Endicott returned alone after hours. He locked himself in the archive and began transcribing fragments from the cylinders. The transcript, later retrieved from his drawer, contains only one repeated phrase: "He never left the earth." When the morning staff arrived, they found the phonograph shattered, its metal parts warped as if melted by heat. Endicott was gone. Only his coat remained hanging on the back of his chair. Beneath it, a fine layer of dark dust covered the floor, later confirmed to be high in iron content, consistent with soil. The university quietly sealed the Voss collection, labeling it damaged, unsuitable for restoration. Yet whispers spread among the faculty that the cylinders sometimes hummed, even when disconnected from power. In a private letter to a colleague, one professor confessed, "The sound is not trapped inside the recording. The recording is what the sound left behind." He resigned the following week, citing auditory persecution. The Voss cylinders have not been played publicly since. By 1923, the parish surrounding the former Grant estate had deteriorated into a scattering of half-abandoned farmsteads and collapsed churches. The railroad that once ran through the region was decommissioned, its timetables blank where the stop should have been. On state maps printed that year, the name of the central township, Bellwether's Crossing, was missing entirely. A faded outline remained, but the label had vanished, as though erased by hand. Census officials visiting the area reported confusion among the remaining residents. When asked their address, most hesitated, unsure how to answer. One woman reportedly said, "We don't have a name anymore. It's better that way." The town school closed in 1925 after the last teacher. Miss Clara Holcomb suffered what local doctors called a nervous seizure. In her journals, found years later, she described hearing voices through the classroom floorboards, children singing in languages she didn't recognize, answering roll call before she spoke their names. Her final entry read, "They say the ground remembers everyone who ever lived here, but it's starting to forget me." A government survey team arrived in 1928 to redraw property boundaries. They found entire streets overgrown, homes empty but recently swept, doors unlocked. Yet in each kitchen a plate sat on the table, as if someone had just risen from dinner. When the Great Flood of 1927 receded, nearby towns rebuilt. But the land once called Bellwether's Crossing was declared uninhabitable. The few remaining families relocated north, leaving behind fields that shimmered with a faint reddish hue when wet. In the archives of the Louisiana Historical Society, there exists one peculiar memo dated 1931. It references a letter from the state governor to Washington, requesting clarification on a missing census district. The reply, brief and chilling, reads, "No record of such township exists in our jurisdiction. To this day, no official map has restored its name. Locals refer to it only as the parish that buried itself." In 1936, a freelance journalist named Harold Trainer arrived in Louisiana, claiming to be writing a series on vanished American towns. Trainer was known for his skepticism, a former crime reporter from Chicago who'd covered murders, frauds, and cult cases with ruthless precision. His letter suggests he believed the rumors surrounding Bellwether's Crossing were rural hysteria. He brought with him a steel recorder, a Kodak camera, and a revolver. In his notes, the first line reads, "Ghost stories thrive where guilt sleeps." The surviving locals refused to guide him past the bayou. One man reportedly spat tobacco on the ground and said, "You'll hear it breathing before you see it." Trainer's journal reconstructs his 3 days within the ruins. He described moss-thick streets, house foundations half swallowed by mud, and a church steeple that leaned like a broken finger toward the sky. Yet his most unsettling entries are about sound. "The place exhales," he wrote on day 2. "When the wind moves through the reeds, it doesn't carry the sound. It carries something under it. I keep thinking it's the river. It's not." That night his audio logs captured a low rhythmic pulse beneath the static. It was not wind, not thunder. It was measured, patient, almost human. He can be heard whispering, "If this is the earth breathing, it's waiting for something." By morning his tent was found collapsed, his camera shattered. The last entry in his notebook reads, "There's someone here. Not walking, just standing. I hear him in the soil." A week later, Trainer's horse was discovered near the main road, reins torn, the saddle soaked through with black mud. His body was never recovered. When his equipment was analyzed, the wax reels contained 13 minutes of uninterrupted silence, until, near the end, there's a single, shallow inhalation. Experts dismissed it as equipment degradation, but one audio technician quit immediately afterward, leaving a note that said, "I don't know who was breathing, but it wasn't him." In 1942, during a wartime scrap metal drive, a group of county workers clearing swampland stumbled upon the remains of a house foundation deep within the reclaimed soil. The structure's footprint matched no existing property records, but its coordinates aligned almost perfectly with where the Grant Plantation once stood. At first, the workers assumed it was a simple homestead ruin, but beneath the collapsed timbers they discovered a series of rooms built below ground, accessible through a spiral staircase of rusted iron. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of iron and rot. The team noted that even their lamps dimmed when lowered into the stairwell. Inside, the walls bore carvings, scores of small handprints, pressed into the stone as if by molten clay. In one chamber stood a single iron bed frame, draped in decayed lace. Beneath it, half buried in silt, lay a nameplate etched in brass. E. Grant. Among the recovered artifacts was a locket, corroded but still intact. When opened, it revealed 2 portraits, one of the widow Eleanor Grant and the other of a man no archivist could identify. His features were strong, his gaze unflinching, but analysis of the photograph revealed a disturbing anomaly: faint impressions of chains imprinted in the background. Though none appeared in the room where it was taken, the discovery was quietly catalogued, and the area reburied under state order. But an internal memo from the parish historical office dated August 14, 1942 states, The structure beneath the foundation appears older than the plantation itself, possibly colonial. The soil around the sublevel wall shows evidence of repeated digging and refilling. This was not a home. It was a chamber. A second note, unsigned, was attached to the report. Do not disturb what was meant to be buried twice. The files were sealed, and within a year the site was flooded again, deliberately, according to later speculation. From that day forward, locals refused to fish in that part of the bayou. They said the water sometimes exhaled. By 1948, the Diocese of New Orleans began quietly collecting testimonies concerning the Grant estate, particularly those involving unusual religious artifacts found in the surrounding parish. Among them were 3 crucifixes, each discovered at separate sites, but all bearing identical alterations. The figure of Christ had been replaced with a faceless, muscular silhouette, arms bound by rope rather than nails. The diocese's internal investigation was led by Father Augustin Devereaux, a historian of Southern monastic orders. His report, marked ad usum internum, for internal use only, suggested that the altered crosses belonged to a splinter sect of Plantation-era Christianity. Their teachings blended scripture with slave folklore, centering around a figure they called the Redeemer who was not redeemed. In the parish records, Devereaux found a sermon transcribed from 1859 titled, "When the Servant Becomes the Master of Flesh." The preacher, Reverend Collier Grant, Eleanor's brother-in-law, had spoken of a man who rose from bondage not by freedom, but by blood, and carried the name of the Lord into the earth. Weeks later, Devereaux requested permission to exhume the remains from the churchyard adjoining the former Grant Chapel. The request was denied. He proceeded anyway. The caretaker who assisted him testified decades later that as they dug, the soil released a sweet metallic odor, like rust mixed with honey. Devereaux struck something solid about 3 feet down, a coffin with its lid split from within. Inside were no remains, only a single rosary. Its beads were fused together by heat. That night the caretaker claimed Devereaux burned his notes and sealed himself inside the chapel, whispering prayers until dawn. When the doors were forced open, the priest was found kneeling before the altar, his eyes wide, his voice gone. The only thing written in the ash beside him were 5 words, "He still answers the hymns." The diocese closed the case, classifying it under liturgical aberrations. The chapel was demolished in 1951. But when parishioners gathered for the final Mass, the organ played, though no one sat at the keys. In 1953, nearly a century after Moses Grant's supposed death, a Louisiana State University research assistant named Evelyn Carter began cataloging the photographic archives of regional plantations. Her work was straightforward, cleaning, labeling, and digitizing fragile glass negatives for the Department of Cultural History. But within weeks she began to report anomalies. The first appeared in a contact sheet from 1871. The image, originally labeled Widow Grant with domestic staff, showed 5 women seated beside Eleanor Grant's veranda. Yet after processing, a 6th figure appeared in the shadows behind them, tall, bare-chested, and unblinking. The exposure time was too short for such clarity. Evelyn assumed a double exposure and reprinted the plate. The figure remained a week later. When reviewing a batch of unrelated negatives, images of cotton presses, livestock, and tools, she noticed faint reflections of chains and surfaces where none should have been. In one, the glint traced the outline of a man's wrist. She developed new plates in total darkness, controlling every variable. Still the figures persisted, becoming sharper, nearer, as if the process itself was summoning what history refused to name. Her supervisor dismissed the findings, accusing her of artistic contamination. Evelyn continued the work privately. That winter her neighbor reported seeing light flickering beneath her apartment door, like a camera flash repeating in intervals. When she failed to appear for work, police entered her home. The bathtub was filled with photographic chemicals, and pinned across the walls were dozens of prints, each one depicting the same scene. The veranda, the women, and the figure standing closer with every frame. On the final photograph, he is no longer behind them. He stands in front, one hand resting on the arm of the widow's chair. No trace of Evelyn Carter was ever found. But in the archive ledger beside her unfinished box of negatives, someone, no one knows who, had written a single word in red pencil: developed. The box remains sealed in storage. Its label reads Bellwether Parish Unverified Image Set 6. In the summer of 1954, torrential rains swept through southern Louisiana, swelling the bayous to their banks. For most of the state, it was another season of flooding, predictable, devastating, survivable. But in the region once known as Bellwether Parish, something else happened. The waters rose, yes, but they did not recede. Residents from neighboring parishes began reporting that the bayou's surface had turned a murky crimson under the moonlight. The smell was metallic, thick like old blood. State environmental agents collected samples and found no natural cause, no algae bloom, no chemical spill. Yet when left overnight, each jar of water separated into two distinct layers, clear liquid above, and a dense sediment the color of rusted flesh beneath. Local fishermen refused to go near the water. Those who did returned pale, trembling. One man claimed the water moved against the current, pushing his boat toward the drowned plantation grounds. Another swore he heard chains dragging below the surface as if something immense was crawling upward. That night, the parish sheriff's office received 7 emergency calls. All described the same phenomenon: the river breathing. Windows shuddered though the air was still. Livestock broke from their pens and stampeded into the fields, only to stop suddenly, as if listening. At dawn, the sky cleared. The crimson hue was gone, but the floodplain had shifted again. Where the Grant estate once stood, there was now a perfect depression in the earth, like a vast footprint. Days later, an aerial survey captured photographs of the flooded region. In one image, sunlight striking the bayou revealed a faint, geometric outline beneath the surface, symmetrical, deliberate, unmistakably human in proportion. The negatives were sent for analysis but never returned. The official report lists them as water damaged. Unconfirmed local testimony insists the water glowed faintly red again on the following Good Friday, just before midnight. Witnesses claimed it wasn't reflection. It was the ground itself bleeding. By 1955, the state declared the Bellwether region uninhabitable. Roads were rerouted, the river remapped, and the parish quietly erased from official documentation. The few who remained spoke little, their voices trembling whenever the rains came. What lingered there was not a story anymore. It was a presence. In 1961, folklorist Dr. Thomas Weil compiled the last known field report about the event. His work never saw publication, but his notes survive in fragments. He wrote that every culture births a god from its deepest wound, that Moses Grant, the enslaved man who killed his master, married the widow and ruled the land that once ruled him, was not merely a man but an idea given flesh, an inversion, a reckoning. A redemption twisted back on itself. Local hymns still whisper his name, though never directly. They call him the one who turned the chains. They say he was buried standing upright so his shadow would never fall. They say the soil under his feet still breathes, still remembers. According to Dr. Weil, every 27 years the parish floods again. Each time the water carries with it traces of iron too high for any geological source. Each time the outline of the plantation reappears beneath the surface, just long enough for one photo, one glimpse, one gasp. The people who live along the bayou don't speak his name anymore. But they leave offerings, rusted nails, scraps of iron, and locks of hair wrapped in twine. When asked why, one elderly woman said simply, Because the land's still deciding who owns who. Dr. Wiles' final field recording ends with silence, 28 seconds of still air. Then faintly a man's voice hums an old slave hymn, slow, deliberate, ancient. It ends with a sound not unlike breathing. The reel was found years later in his abandoned car parked beside the Bayou road. The driver's door was open. Mud footprints led from the water to the seat and stopped. To this day, the soil there never dries. Locals say it's not mud, it's memory. And sometimes on nights when the water turns red, they whisper, "Moses never left."